one last chance, old man. You are obstructing justice.
Then I guess you'll have to arrest me.
Fine. You brought this on yourself.
The Silver Spoon Diner wasn't a throwback. It was a survivor. It existed in a pocket of Oak Haven where time seemed to have been forgotten, a place where the chrome was still polished by hand, and the red leather of the booth seats was cracked and softened from 60 years of conversations, arguments, and quiet morning coffees. Sunlight, thick with the laziness of a mid-morning Tuesday, streamed through the large plate glass windows, illuminating swirling dust motes and the faint sheen of grease that coated every surface with a nostalgic glow. The air smelled of frying bacon, burnt coffee, and the faint, sweet perfume of pancake syrup, the holy trinity of American breakfasts. In a corner booth, the one with the best view of the entire diner and the street outside, sat two men. They were studies in contrast, yet moved with the easy, unspoken rhythm of lifelong friends. Marcus Vance was a man built on a scale that demanded attention. Tall and broad-shouldered, he filled his side of the booth, his simple gray hoodie and worn denim jeans doing little to disguise the powerful frame of a man who had spent his youth on basketball courts and his adulthood in boardrooms. At 42, he was an architect, a shaper of skylines, a man whose mind worked in angles and load-bearing capacities. But here in the quiet of the Silver Spoon, he was just a man enjoying a rare, peaceful breakfast. Across from him, sipping his coffee with a deliberate slowness, was David Williams. At 40, Williams was leaner than his friend, his presence less about physical space and more about a contained, observant energy. He wore a simple, well-tailored navy blue suit, but the jacket was off, slung over the back of the booth, and his white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. He looked like an accountant, maybe a mid-level corporate manager, unremarkable, professional, the kind of man who could blend into any office environment without a second glance. His hands were steady, his gaze calm as he listened to Marcus recount a ridiculous argument with a city zoning commissioner. "So I tell him," Marcus was saying, gesturing with a piece of toast, "the cantilever design is perfectly sound. We've run the models a dozen times. It's not going to collapse." And he looks at me, this little guy with a comb-over, and says, "It just looks aggressive." Aggressive! David, can a building look aggressive? Williams allowed a small, rare smile to touch his lips. "Anything can look aggressive if you're scared enough, my friend. You know that." Their friendship was forged in the crucible of a neighborhood that had demanded they be tough, smart, or invisible to survive. They had chosen all three at different times. They had played on the same cracked asphalt courts, studied in the same underfunded libraries, and dreamed of worlds far beyond the one they knew. Marcus had found his escape in the clean, logical lines of architecture, building a new world one blueprint at a time. Williams had chosen a different path. He had walked into the heart of the system they had always been taught to distrust, believing he could change it, or at least hold it accountable, from the inside. The bell above the diner door chimed, a cheerful, tinkling sound that announced every new arrival. Neither man paid it much mind. It was Hank, the owner, a stoop-shouldered man in his late 60s with flour permanently dusted on his apron, or one of the regulars, the retired mailman who read the paper at the counter, the young mother grabbing a coffee before school pickup. The Silver Spoon had a rhythm, and the bell was just part of its gentle, predictable percussion. Marcus was laughing now, a deep, rolling sound that made the salt and pepper shakers on the table vibrate. "I swear, I should have just built him a brick box. He would have given it a key to the city." "Predictability is comforting," Williams noted, taking another slow sip of his coffee. He had that way about him, an unnerving stillness. While Marcus was all expressive energy and broad gestures, Williams was a study in conservation of motion. He watched, he listened, and when he spoke, the words were measured, each one chosen with purpose. It was a discipline learned over 15 years of navigating situations where the wrong word, the wrong glance, could have deadly consequences. It was this stillness that made him notice the shift first. The cheerful hum of the diner hadn't stopped, but it had changed in pitch. The laughter from a nearby table faded. The clatter of cutlery from the kitchen seemed to pause. It was a subtle change, the kind of atmospheric pressure drop that precedes a storm. Williams didn't move, but his eyes, calm and dark, lifted from his coffee cup and scanned the room. He saw it immediately, the source of the disturbance. Officer Miller of the Oak Haven Police Department stood just inside the doorway. He was a young man, maybe 32, with a short, military-style haircut and a face that seemed permanently fixed in a self-satisfied smirk. He let the door swing shut behind him and stood for a moment, his posture a declaration of authority. His hand rested casually on the butt of his holstered Glock, a gesture that was meant to look relaxed but was anything but. His eyes swept across the room, a predator surveying his territory. They passed over the white family in the front booth, the elderly couple near the window, the young college student typing on a laptop. They paused for less than a second on Hank behind the counter before continuing their sweep. And then they stopped. They locked onto the corner booth, onto the two black men sitting there. The smirk on Miller's face tightened. In his mind, the lazy Tuesday morning had just presented him with a problem to solve, a nail to be hammered. He saw two men who didn't belong. He saw a large, powerfully built man in a hoodie, a threat. He saw another man in a suit, which in his calculus didn't make him less suspicious, just more cleverly disguised. Without speaking to anyone, without a moment of observation, he began to walk toward their table. Each step was heavy, deliberate, echoing on the worn linoleum floor. The quiet rhythm of the silver spoon was broken. The peaceful morning was over. Williams watched him approach, his expression unreadable, and took one last, slow sip of his coffee. The bond between Marcus Vance and David Williams was forged from shared experience, a silent understanding of the world they inhabited. Growing up, they were the two tall kids, inseparable on the basketball court, in the classroom, and during the long, hot summers where they navigated the complex social geography of their neighborhood. Marcus was the dreamer, the artist, sketching fantastical buildings in the margins of his notebooks. Williams was the strategist, the observer, the one who could read a room, or a street corner, in seconds, calculating risks and outcomes with a quiet, unnerving precision. This fundamental difference in their personalities had shaped their adult lives. Marcus built things. He took chaos and imposed order, creating structures of steel and glass that were tangible, beautiful, and permanent. His success was visible, celebrated. He was a pillar of the community, a testament to breaking through barriers. Yet, he never forgot the weight of perception. He knew that to many, no matter how successful he became, his size and the color of his skin would always be the first things they saw. He wore his hoodies and jeans not as a statement, but for comfort, an echo of the boy he once was. He refused to change his appearance to make others feel more at ease, believing his accomplishments and character should be enough. It was a quiet, daily act of defiance. Williams, on the other hand, had chosen a different form of defiance. After college, while Marcus went into architecture, David shocked everyone by applying to the FBI. His family had pleaded with him. His friends had called him a traitor, unable to understand why one of their own would willingly join a system that had, for generations, been a source of fear and oppression in their community. "You can't fix a broken house by standing outside and yelling at it," David had told Marcus one night. "Sometimes you have to go inside, learn the layout, and find the weak spots in the foundation." And so he went inside. He cut his hair, bought the suits, and mastered the art of blending in. He became Special Agent Williams, a name that felt both foreign and powerful. He learned to compartmentalize, to mask his emotions behind a face of professional calm. He worked organized crime, counterterrorism, and for the last 5 years he had been a key figure in a federal task force investigating civil rights violations and police misconduct. It was dangerous, often soul-crushing work. He had seen the very worst of humanity, but he had also seen the power of a single, well-placed piece of evidence to bring a corrupt system to its knees. His job was a secret he kept tightly guarded, known only to his immediate family and to Marcus. To the rest of the world, he was a government consultant, a vague title that invited no follow-up questions. This anonymity was his shield and his weapon. It allowed him to move through the world and observe it as it truly was. He saw how people treated him when they thought he was just another black man in a suit, and he filed it all away in the vast, meticulous archive of his mind. Their breakfasts at the Silver Spoon were a ritual, a sanctuary. It was the one place they could shed the armor they wore every day. Here, Marcus wasn't the celebrated architect, and David wasn't a federal agent. They were just two friends, sharing stories, laughing about the past, and worrying about the future. It was a space free from the burden of perception that followed them everywhere else. As Officer Miller approached their table, Williams felt a familiar, cold weight settle in his gut. It was the feeling he got at the start of every investigation, the moment when the abstract threat of injustice became a tangible, present reality. He had seen this scene play out hundreds of times, in grainy body cam footage, in tearful witness testimonies, in sterile incident reports. The swaggering walk, the hand hovering near the weapon, the eyes that had already passed judgment. He knew the script by heart. Marcus felt it too, but his reaction was different. It was a hot flash of anger, a deep, weary frustration. He had done everything right. He had built a successful career, contributed to his community, and lived an exemplary life. And yet, none of that mattered. In this moment, in this diner, he was being reduced to a stereotype, a big black man in a hoodie who looked suspicious. He consciously untensed his shoulders, placed his hands flat on the table in plain sight, and prepared himself for the familiar, demeaning dance he had been forced to learn. Williams, however, remained perfectly still. His training took over, a series of silent, automatic calculations. Subject is male, white, approximately 32 years old. Posture is aggressive, confrontational. Right hand is resting on firearm. No visible immediate threat, but displaying multiple pre-assault indicators. Scan the environment. 3 other customers have noticed. Hank, the owner, is watching from behind the counter. Multiple cell phones are present in the room. Multiple potential witnesses. My own weapon is concealed. Ankle holster, left leg. Unnecessary at this stage. Objective: de-escalate if possible. Observe and document if not. He watched Miller stop at their table, the officer's shadow falling over them like a shroud. Miller deliberately positioned himself in a way that pinned them in the booth, a classic intimidation tactic. He was standing too close, violating their personal space, forcing them to look up at him. It was a power play, as subtle as a sledgehammer. "Morning, officer," Marcus said, his voice even and calm, betraying none of the fire he felt inside. "Is there a problem?" Miller ignored the greeting. He didn't look at Marcus. His eyes were locked on Williams, the man in the suit, the one he had likely pegged as the brains of this imaginary operation. The smirk on his face was gone, replaced by a cold, hard mask of authority. He was performing, and the entire diner was now his unwilling audience. 5 miles away and 20 minutes earlier, Officer Chad Miller had been sitting in his patrol car, nursing a lukewarm coffee and scrolling through social media on his phone. His patrol of Oak Haven's quiet downtown district was, as usual, mind-numbingly dull. Oak Haven was not a place where things happened. It was a town of bake sales, high school football games, and sleepy Sunday mornings. For a man like Miller, who had joined the force with visions of high-speed chases and dramatic takedowns, the reality of his job was a constant, simmering disappointment. At 32, Miller felt trapped. He had grown up in Oak Haven, a big fish in a small pond, the star quarterback who had never quite managed to leave his glory days behind. He'd tried college for a year, but found the discipline and intellectual challenge grating. He'd worked a series of dead-end jobs before joining the Oak Haven Police Department 5 years ago, drawn by the uniform, the authority, and the promise of respect he felt the world owed him. But the respect he craved never fully materialized. His fellow officers found him arrogant and overly aggressive. His supervisors saw him as a man with a short fuse and poor judgment. His personnel file was already thicker than it should have been for a 5-year veteran. 2 formal complaints for excessive force during routine traffic stops, both involving minority drivers. Another for an illegal search. Each time, the department's internal investigation had cleared him, citing insufficient evidence or chalking it up to a suspect's failure to comply. But the pattern was there, a series of red flags that his superiors had chosen to ignore, not wanting to deal with the hassle and paperwork of serious disciplinary action. Miller had learned a clear lesson from these experiences. As long as he could articulate a reason, any reason for his suspicion, his actions would be defended. The radio on his dash crackled to life, breaking the silence. Unit 12, respond to a call from the Silver Spoon Diner on Main Street. Caller reports 2 suspicious males. Possible 211 in progress. Miller sat up, a jolt of adrenaline cutting through his boredom. 211. Robbery. This was it. This was real police work. Unit 12, copy, on my way, he responded, his voice a little too eager. He tossed his coffee in the trash and peeled out of the parking lot, foregoing his siren but driving well over the speed limit. The details of the dispatch were, to a trained officer, almost uselessly vague. The dispatcher's notes, which flashed on his in-car terminal, were telling in what they omitted. Caller, who refused to give a name, states 2 black males are sitting in a corner booth and look like they're casing the place. Caller believes they may be planning to rob the bank next door. No overt criminal activity witnessed. No weapons seen. A seasoned, objective officer would have treated the call with extreme caution. The language was coded, dripping with racial bias. Casing the place was a common descriptor used by prejudiced callers to justify their fear of black men simply existing in a public space. An anonymous caller. No specific criminal act, no weapons. It was a textbook example of a bias-based call, the kind that often led to illegal stops and unnecessary escalations. But Chad Miller was not a seasoned, objective officer. He was a man looking for a confrontation, a man who saw the world through a lens of suspicion and resentment. To him, the words 2 black males and suspicious were all the probable cause he needed. He didn't question the caller's motives. He adopted them as his own. In his mind, he wasn't responding to a vague report. He was heroically intervening to stop a violent crime before it happened. The narrative was already written in his head. He was the hero. They were the villains. By the time he pulled up to the Silver Spoon, his heart was pounding with anticipation. He parked his cruiser 2 spots down, giving himself a tactical approach. He took a deep breath, adjusted his duty belt, and put on what his academy instructor had called his command presence, a mask of unwavering, intimidating authority. He pushed open the diner door, and the scene played out exactly as he had imagined. His eyes did a quick, dismissive scan of the non-threats, the white families, the elderly, and then, like a heat-seeking missile, locked on to Marcus and Williams. Jackpot. The hoodie, the large frame, the other one in a suit trying to look legitimate, the corner booth, a perfect vantage point to watch the comings and goings of the bank next door. Every detail, filtered through his prejudiced worldview, confirmed his suspicion. He didn't see 2 friends having breakfast. He saw 2 predators waiting to strike. He never considered for a moment that he could be wrong. He never thought to sit at the counter, order a coffee, and simply observe. He never considered asking the owner, Hank, if the men were regulars or if they had caused any trouble. His mind had leaped from suspicion to conclusion without ever bothering to walk the path of investigation. The presumption of innocence was a luxury he did not extend to the men in the corner booth. As he began his deliberate, heavy-footed walk toward them, he felt a surge of power. The boredom of his morning was gone, replaced by the thrilling certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. He was the law in Oakhaven, and he was about to prove it. The small audience in the diner only fueled his sense of self-importance. He would be firm, decisive, and in control. He would show everyone what a real cop looked like. The possibility that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career never once crossed his mind. The silence that fell over the corner booth was thick and heavy. Officer Miller stood over them, his presence sucking the air out of the small space. His expression was a flat, unyielding mask of authority. He didn't repeat Marcus's polite question or offer any explanation. He simply stared, letting the weight of his uniform do the talking for him. Marcus kept his hands on the table, his posture deliberately non-threatening. He had been through this before. The key was to remain calm, to not give the officer any excuse to escalate. "Is there something we can help you with, officer?" he asked again, his voice a low, steady baritone. Miller finally spoke, his voice sharp and devoid of any courtesy. "I need to see some ID, both of you, now!" It wasn't a request, it was an order, delivered with the clear expectation of immediate, unquestioning compliance. The word "now" hung in the air, a verbal slap in the face. Williams, who had been watching the officer with an unnerving stillness, slowly placed his coffee cup down on its saucer. The small clink of porcelain on porcelain was the only sound in their immediate vicinity. He didn't reach for his wallet. He didn't move a muscle. He simply looked at Miller, his gaze level and analytical. Marcus took the lead. "With all due respect, officer," he said, keeping his tone measured, "why are you asking for our identification? We're just sitting here having breakfast." Miller's jaw tightened. He clearly wasn't accustomed to being questioned. "I got a call," he said, clipping his words. "A report of 2 suspicious individuals matching your description. Now, are you going to show me your IDs, or do we need to have a different kind of conversation?" The veiled threat was obvious. It was the classic comply or else tactic, designed to intimidate citizens into surrendering their rights out of fear. "A suspicious individuals report?" Marcus pressed, a slight edge of disbelief in his voice. "What exactly was suspicious about us? The fact that we ordered pancakes? Or was it the coffee?" A few patrons at nearby tables who had been trying to pretend they weren't listening now looked over openly. A young woman 2 booths away subtly angled her phone, its camera lens now aimed in their direction. The confrontation was no longer a private matter. Miller's eyes narrowed. He saw Marcus's questions not as a legitimate inquiry into his legal authority, but as an act of defiance. It was disrespect, a challenge to his power in front of an audience. "Look," Miller snapped, his voice rising in volume, "I don't have to explain myself to you. The bank next door is a frequent target. You 2 are sitting here in a tactical position observing the entrance. That's enough for me. Last time I'm going to ask you nicely. IDs." The accusation was absurd. The booth they were in faced the diner's kitchen, not the street. To see the bank, they would have had to crane their necks at an unnatural angle. It was a lie, a clumsy, transparent fabrication to justify his actions. It was at this moment that Williams finally spoke. His voice was quiet, yet it cut through Miller's aggressive tone with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Officer," he began, his eyes still locked on Miller's, "under Terry versus Ohio, you are required to have reasonable, articulable suspicion that a specific criminal act has occurred, is occurring, or is about to occur in order to demand identification. You've just stated your suspicion is based on a vague, anonymous call and our location in this booth, a location which, I might add, does not provide a view of the bank you're referring to." He paused, letting his words sink in. "So I'll ask you directly, what specific articulable facts lead you to believe that we, specifically, are engaged in criminal activity?" The legal precision of the question seemed to momentarily stun Miller. He had expected fear, or angry shouting, or immediate compliance. He had not expected a calm, well-reasoned legal challenge from a man in a suit. His face flushed with anger. This wasn't going according to his script. He was losing control of the narrative. "Are you a lawyer?" Miller sneered, attempting to regain his footing by resorting to ridicule. "I'm a citizen who knows his rights," Williams replied evenly, without a hint of emotion. "A right that you are currently violating. Your demand for our identification under these circumstances constitutes an unlawful seizure under the Fourth Amendment." The air crackled with tension. Williams had drawn a clear line in the sand, not with anger, but with the cold, hard language of the law. He had taken Miller's vague assertions of authority and dismantled them piece by piece, exposing the stop for what it was, an illegal, bias-based fishing expedition. For a moment, Miller was speechless. He looked from Williams's calm, unblinking face to Marcus's steady, waiting expression. He was being challenged, outmaneuvered, and he could feel the eyes of the entire diner on him. His training, what little of it had stuck, told him to de-escalate, to perhaps walk away. But his ego, his arrogance, and the prejudice that had driven him here in the first place would not let him back down. He felt cornered, and like any cornered animal, he chose to lash out. The flush on Officer Miller's face deepened to a dark, mottled red. He had been publicly challenged and legally cornered. For a man whose authority was built on a foundation of intimidation rather than respect, this was an intolerable situation. His attempt to control the encounter had failed, and now he abandoned all pretense of professional conduct. He chose to go on the attack, not with law or procedure, but with raw, undisguised bigotry. He leaned forward, planting both hands on their table, his knuckles white. The action was deliberately invasive, a final physical attempt to dominate the space. "Let me be real clear with you," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl that was somehow more threatening than his shouting. He pointed a finger at Williams. "You can quote whatever laws you want. You can play smart, but I've been a cop in this town for 5 years, and I know how things work." He shifted his venomous gaze to Marcus. "And I know your kind. You roll into a quiet town like this, you think no one's watching. You got the big guy in the hoodie for the muscle." He gestured dismissively at Marcus. "And you got the smooth talker in the suit to handle the rest." The words, "your kind," landed in the quiet diner with the force of a physical blow. It was no longer about a suspicious call or a bank robbery. Miller had torn away the thin veil of police procedure and revealed the ugly prejudice simmering beneath. He was no longer a police officer investigating a potential crime. He was a bigot enforcing his own twisted worldview. Marcus, who had remained stoically calm, felt a tremor of pure rage go through him. He clenched his fists under the table, his knuckles pressing into the worn wood. He had heard those words before in different contexts, from different mouths, but they never lost their power to wound, to erase his identity and replace it with a hateful caricature. He took a slow, deep breath, fighting for the control he had so carefully maintained. Williams's expression did not change. His face remained a mask of impenetrable calm, but a flicker of something cold and hard entered his eyes. He was no longer just an observer. He was now the target of a hate-based confrontation, and every word Miller uttered was being meticulously recorded in his memory, a verbatim transcript for the report he knew he would eventually write. "My kind?" Williams repeated the words, his voice dangerously quiet. "And what kind is that, officer?" It was a challenge, daring Miller to say it, to put his bigotry into plain, undeniable language. Miller smirked, a cruel, ugly twisting of his lips. He felt he had regained control, that he had finally rattled the calm man in the suit. "You know what I'm talking about. Every time there's trouble, a robbery, a drug deal, you name it, it's always the same story. It's always you people." He straightened up, puffing out his chest, his rant gaining momentum. "I saw you the second I walked in. I got the call, and I knew. I just knew. You can't help yourselves. It's just what you do." The collective gasp from the other patrons was audible. The young woman who had been filming now held her phone up brazenly, no longer trying to hide it. An older man at the counter slowly shook his head in disgust. Even Hank, the owner, who had been watching with growing concern from behind the counter, started to wipe his hands on his apron, a nervous tick that signaled he was about to intervene. This was the point of no return. Miller had crossed a line, not just a legal or procedural one, but a fundamental line of human decency. He had verbally assaulted two men based on nothing more than the color of their skin in a public place while wearing the uniform that was meant to represent justice for all. "So let me get this straight, officer," Marcus said, his voice now laced with an icy fury that was more chilling than any shout. "You are detaining us without probable cause, not because of any action we have taken, but solely because we are black men. Is that an accurate summary of this situation?" Miller, caught up in his own hateful rhetoric, didn't even hesitate. "You can call it whatever you want. I call it good police work. I'm stopping a crime before it happens." He jabbed a finger toward the door. "Now, for the last time, give me your IDs or I'm taking you both out of here in cuffs. Your choice." The threat of arrest wasn't just a threat anymore, it was a promise. He had backed himself into a corner with his own bigotry, and the only way out he could see was to escalate further, to use the force of his position to crush their resistance and validate his prejudice. He was no longer thinking about the law, about procedure, or even about the consequences. He was running on pure, unadulterated racism, and he was daring them to challenge him one last time. The air in the diner was thick with a toxic silence, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus and Williams exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance. The look that passed between them was one of grim understanding. The time for de-escalation was over. A line had been crossed, and now a different kind of response was required. The gauntlet had been thrown. The threat of handcuffs and a humiliating, unlawful arrest hung heavy in the air. Marcus looked at Officer Miller, at the man's face, which was now a mask of smug certainty. He saw not just an officer of the law, but the embodiment of a fear he had lived with his entire life. The fear of being judged, condemned, and punished by a system that saw his skin color as a synonym for guilt. In that moment, Marcus made a decision. He would not be intimidated. He would not be bullied into silence. He owed it to himself, to the boy he once was, and to every other person who had ever been in his position without the resources or the composure to fight back. "Officer," Marcus began, his voice ringing with a clarity and strength that commanded the attention of everyone in the diner. He slowly rose to his feet, a towering but controlled presence. He didn't invade Miller's space, but his height alone shifted the power dynamic. He was no longer looking up at the officer, they were now eye to eye. "Let me be the one to be real clear now." Williams remained seated, a silent, watchful anchor, his presence a tacit endorsement of his friend's stand. "You have no legal grounds to arrest us," Marcus stated, his words precise and deliberate. "An arrest would be for contempt of cop, not for any crime we have committed. You know it, I know it, and I'm fairly certain your body camera, which I trust is recording this entire interaction, knows it too." He gestured around the diner. "Furthermore, you are making these threats in a room full of witnesses, all of whom have watched you approach us without cause, harass us without reason, and profile us based on the color of our skin. Several of them," he added, nodding slightly toward the woman with the phone, "are also recording this. Your actions are being documented, officer, extensively." Miller's smirk faltered for the first time. The mention of the body camera and the other witnesses seemed to pierce through his bubble of self-righteous anger. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by a renewed wave of belligerence. He couldn't back down now. He had committed too fully to this path. "Are you threatening me?" Miller blustered, his hand instinctively moving from his belt to rest directly on the grip of his pistol. It was a blatant, unprofessional escalation, a clear signal that he was prepared to introduce the threat of deadly force into the encounter. The sight of the officer's hand on his weapon sent a fresh wave of shock through the diner. Hank, the owner, dropped the rag he was holding. The atmosphere shifted from tense to dangerous. Williams noted the action with cold, analytical detachment. Subject has placed hand on firearm, a clear threat of force in response to a verbal challenge. This has now escalated from a Fourth Amendment violation to a potential excessive force situation. Marcus saw the hand on the gun and felt a cold knot of fear tighten in his stomach, but he refused to let it show. His voice remained steady, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "No, officer, I am not threatening you," he said, holding his empty hands up slightly, palms forward in a gesture of peace. "I am informing you of the facts. I am stating for the record that you are the one who is escalating this situation. You are the one who is making threats. You are the one whose hand is on his weapon while talking to two unarmed men who are trying to eat breakfast. We are not the aggressors here. You are." Every word was a hammer blow of truth, chipping away at Miller's fragile authority. He had expected Marcus to cower, to submit. He had not expected this articulate, unshakable defiance. He was losing, and he knew it. His entire sense of control was slipping away, being dismantled in front of an audience. "You're a real smart guy, aren't you?" Miller sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He was grasping at straws, trying to regain dominance through insults. "You think you can talk your way out of this? I am the law here. What I say goes. Now sit down, shut your mouth, and give me your ID before I decide you're resisting arrest." "Resisting a lawful arrest is a crime, officer," Williams interjected calmly from his seat, his voice cutting in with quiet authority. "But one cannot be charged with resisting an unlawful arrest, and any arrest you make here today would be, by definition, unlawful. You are creating a crime where none exists to justify your own illegal actions. That, officer, is a very dangerous road for you to be on." Williams's words, combined with Marcus's towering, defiant stance, formed a two-pronged assault on Miller's position. One was a moral and public stand. The other was a cold, legal trap. Miller was caught between them. He looked back and forth between the two men, his face a storm of confusion, anger, and a dawning, terrifying sense of panic. He had gone too far. He had miscalculated. The situation had spun completely out of his control. But his pride, the same toxic pride that had started this whole encounter, still wouldn't let him retreat. He had to win. He had to prove he was in charge. His hand tightened on the grip of his pistol. Hank Kowalski had owned the Silver Spoon for 41 years. He'd inherited it from his father, who had opened it in 1955. In that time, Hank had seen Oak Haven change from a sleepy farming town to a bustling suburb. He'd served generations of families, watched kids who used to steal sugar packets from the counter grow up and bring their own children in for milkshakes. He was a man who believed in a few simple things: a hot cup of coffee, a perfectly cooked egg, and treating people with basic human decency. From his post behind the worn Formica counter, Hank had watched the entire scene unfold with a growing sense of dread. He knew Officer Miller. He'd seen him around town, had heard the stories about his short temper and aggressive attitude. Hank had served cops his whole life. He respected the badge and the difficult job they did. But he also knew a bad apple when he saw one, and Chad Miller was rotten to the core. He also knew Marcus and David. They'd been coming in for breakfast every few weeks for years. They were quiet, polite, and always left a good tip. They were his customers. And in Hank's simple, unwavering moral code, you protected your customers. When he saw Miller put his hand on his gun, something inside Hank snapped. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. This wasn't a cop doing his job. This was a bully with a badge terrorizing two good men in the middle of his diner. He threw his dish towel onto the counter with a decisive thwack and started walking out from behind it. He was 68 years old with a bad back and hands swollen with arthritis, but as he approached the corner booth, he walked with the steady, determined gait of a man who had made up his mind. He stopped a few feet away, deliberately placing himself in the tense space between Miller and the two men. First, he looked at Marcus and David, giving them a small, reassuring nod. Then, he turned his tired, watery blue eyes on Officer Miller. "All right, Chad, that's enough," Hank said, his voice raspy but firm. He used the officer's first name, a subtle but powerful act of stripping away the impersonal shield of his uniform. Miller, startled by the intervention, whipped his head around. "Stay out of this, Hank. This is official police business." "Official business?" Hank scoffed, his disbelief evident. I'll tell you what I see. I see two of my customers who haven't done a single thing wrong being harassed. And I see a police officer who looks like he's about to make a terrible mistake. So no, I don't think I will stay out of it. Not in my place of business. Hank's intervention changed the energy in the room. It was one thing for the suspects to argue for their rights. It was another entirely for a neutral, respected member of the white community to step in and publicly condemn the officer's actions. It validated everything Marcus and Williams had been saying. These men are under investigation, Miller insisted, trying to project an authority that was rapidly eroding. They fit the description of suspects in a robbery call. Hank's tired eyes narrowed. He was a simple man, but he was not a fool. Fit the description. The description of what, Chad? Of being black? Because that's the only crime I see them committing. They ordered the Tuesday special, same as they do every time they're in here. Is that against the law now? He gestured around the diner. You're upsetting my customers. You're scaring my staff. You walked in here looking for a fight, and you're the only one causing a disturbance. These men have been nothing but gentlemen. Miller was incensed. Being undermined by his targets was one thing. Being publicly dressed down by an old diner owner was a humiliation he could not stomach. His face contorted with rage. "Hank, I'm warning you," he snarled, taking a threatening step toward the older man. "You are interfering with a police investigation. That is a crime. Now back off and let me do my job." But Hank stood his ground. He had faced down angry drunks, kitchen fires, and IRS audits. A young, power-tripping cop was not going to intimidate him. "Your job?" Hank's voice rose, filled with a righteous indignation that had been building for years of watching his town change, not always for the better. "Your job is to protect and serve. Who are you protecting right now, Chad? Your own ego? You're not serving anyone. You're terrorizing people. You're bringing hate and fear into my diner, a place where everyone is supposed to be welcome." He pointed a shaky, arthritis-gnarled finger at the officer. "These are good men. They are my customers, and as long as they are in my establishment, they are under my protection. If you want to arrest them, you'll have to go through me." It was a stunning act of defiance. A simple diner owner, armed with nothing but his own moral conviction, standing up to an armed police officer in defense of two men he knew only as quiet, regular customers. It was a brave, reckless, and profoundly decent thing to do. And for Officer Chad Miller, it was the final straw. His carefully constructed world of authority and control had completely crumbled, and now he was going to make someone pay for it. The sight of Hank Kowalski, a man who represented the heart and soul of old Oakhaven, standing as a human shield between him and his targets, sent Officer Miller into a spiral of uncontrolled fury. The challenge to his authority was now coming from all sides, from the calm, legal precision of Williams, the defiant moral clarity of Marcus, and now the simple, stubborn decency of the diner owner. In his mind, this was no longer an investigation, it was a mutiny. "You think you can tell me how to do my job?" Miller hissed, his face inches from Hank's. The smell of stale coffee was hot on his breath. "You think you're some kind of hero, old man?" He jabbed a finger into Hank's chest, a sharp, aggressive poke. "You're not protecting anyone. You are obstructing justice, and I am done being patient." The physical contact, the act of putting his hands on the elderly owner, was another shocking escalation. Miller was completely unhinged, operating far outside the bounds of policy, law, or reason. "I'm giving you one last chance, Hank," Miller said, his voice a low, venomous whisper for Hank's ears only. "You turn around, go back behind your counter, and you forget you saw anything. You do that, and I forget about the fact that you just committed a crime. You don't, and I'll be arresting 3 people today instead of 2. Hank didn't flinch. He looked Miller square in the eye, his own gaze filled not with fear, but with a profound and weary disappointment. "Then I guess you'll have to arrest me," Hank said quietly, "because I'm not going anywhere." That was it. The last thread of Miller's self-control snapped. He was going to make good on his threat. He was going to arrest this old man right here, right now, to prove to everyone in the room that he was the one in charge. "Fine," Miller spat out. He reached for the handcuffs clipped to the back of his duty belt. "You brought this on yourself." As he fumbled to unclip the cuffs, a collective horrified gasp rippled through the diner. Patrons were now standing up, their phones all pointed at the scene. This was no longer just profiling, it was an assault on a beloved community elder. Miller was not just arresting suspects anymore, he was arresting the very idea of Oakhaven itself. Marcus took an involuntary step forward. "Hey, leave him alone! He hasn't done anything!" "You shut up!" Miller wheeled on him, pointing with the still dangling handcuffs. "You're next!" The situation had devolved into pure chaos, driven entirely by one officer's fragile ego and unchecked prejudice. It was about to become a full-blown physical altercation, an unlawful arrest of an elderly man, and a potential disaster for everyone involved. And throughout it all, David Williams had remained seated. He had watched every moment, every word, every gesture, with the cold, dispassionate focus of a bomb disposal expert watching a timer tick down. He had let the situation play out, letting Miller build his own legal coffin, nail by nail. He had listened to the racist tirades, the baseless accusations, the illegal orders, and the threats. He had watched his best friend stand up with courage and dignity. He had watched a good man, a stranger, risk his own freedom for what was right. He had all the evidence he needed. The case was open and shut. Now, it was time to end it. As Miller turned back toward Hank, handcuffs in hand, ready to make the arrest that would seal his own fate, Williams moved. There was no sudden or jerky motion. It was a fluid, economical movement, practiced and precise. He didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, in a calm, clear tone that sliced through the chaos, "Officer Miller, that's enough." Miller, annoyed by the interruption, glanced back at him. "What did I tell you about—" His voice trailed off as he saw what Williams was doing. Williams was not reaching for a weapon. He was not cowering. He was slowly, deliberately, reaching into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, which was slung over the back of the booth seat. Miller's cop brain, what was left of it, screamed "Gun!" for a split second. A triumphant, vicious grin spread across his face. This was the justification he needed. "He's reaching!" he started to yell, his hand dropping to his own pistol. But what emerged from Williams's jacket was not a weapon. It was a small black leather wallet. It looked like any other wallet, and for a moment, Miller thought the man was finally complying, finally getting his ID. The grin on his face widened into a smug sneer. He had won. He had broken them. Williams didn't open the wallet to a driver's license. He flipped it open to the other side. With a flick of his thumb, a small, polished piece of metal on a leather backing was revealed. He placed the open wallet on the table. He didn't flash it. He just set it down, letting it lie there for everyone to see. The lighting in the diner wasn't great, but the object on the table caught the overhead fluorescent glare and gleamed with an unmistakable cold authority. It was a gold shield, intricately engraved. At the top, in bold blue enamel letters, were the words Federal Bureau of Investigation, and below that, Department of Justice. The world inside the Silver Spoon Diner seemed to stop. The ambient hum of the refrigerators, the distant clatter from the kitchen, the panicked breathing of the patrons, it all faded into a roaring silence in Officer Miller's ears. His brain, which had been running hot with rage and adrenaline, struggled to process the information his eyes were sending it. He stared at the badge on the table. It wasn't a fake. It wasn't a prop. It was heavy, real, and radiated an authority that dwarfed his own small-town police shield into insignificance. The letters FBI seemed to burn into his retinas. His body, which had been coiled like a spring, ready to arrest Hank, went slack. The handcuffs, still dangling from one finger, felt impossibly heavy, like anchors pulling him down. The triumphant sneer on his face melted away, replaced by a rapid succession of emotions. First, blank confusion, then dawning comprehension, then a wave of pure, gut-wrenching shock. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Agent David Williams slowly rose to his feet. He moved with a newfound weight, his easygoing demeanor replaced by the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who held all the cards. He was no longer David, the government consultant. He was Special Agent Williams of the United States Department of Justice. "Officer Chad Miller," Williams said, and his voice had changed. The quiet, conversational tone was gone. This was his command voice, a tone that was flat, precise, and carried the full weight of the federal government. "You are to release that man immediately." He nodded toward Hank. "You are to remove your hand from your weapon, and you are to stand by for instruction. Is that understood?" It wasn't a question. It was an order from a superior officer in a vastly superior agency. Miller's hand flew from his pistol as if it had been burned. He took a clumsy step back from Hank, his eyes still wide and locked on the badge. The entire diner was frozen in a state of collective disbelief. Hank stared at the badge, then at Williams, then back at the badge. The pieces were clicking into place in his mind. The man's calm, his precision, his knowledge of the law, it all made sense now. The young woman with the phone let out a small, audible gasp, her camera still recording the stunning reversal of fortune. Marcus remained standing, a silent, powerful sentinel at his friend's side. He looked from the badge to Miller's crumbling facade, and for the first time that morning, he allowed himself to feel a sliver of grim satisfaction. I didn't know," Miller stammered, the words tumbling out weak and pathetic. It was the first thing he could think to say, the universal excuse of someone caught red-handed. "You didn't know," Williams repeated, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "You didn't know we were citizens of the United States, entitled to the protections of the Constitution? You didn't know that you needed probable cause to detain us? You didn't know that it was illegal to threaten a business owner for defending his customers? Which part exactly did you not know, officer?" Every question was a twisting knife, eviscerating Miller's pathetic defense. You should have told me who you were," Miller pleaded, his voice cracking. He was desperately searching for a way to shift the blame, to make this their fault. "Why?" Williams shot back, his voice like ice. "So you could have treated us with a professional courtesy that you denied us based on the color of our skin. My status as a federal officer is irrelevant to the litany of civil rights violations you have committed here today. You weren't supposed to treat us with respect because I have a badge. You were supposed to treat us with respect because we are human beings." He let the words hang in the silent diner. Then he looked directly at Miller, his eyes cold and hard as granite. "You just spent the last 20 minutes creating an evidence trail for a federal civil rights investigation. And the star witness," he said with a chilling finality, "is you." Miller's face went pale, the color draining from it until it was the pasty white of uncooked dough. Federal civil rights investigation. Those were the words that ended careers, the words that led to indictments, to prison sentences. The vague, distant consequences of an internal affairs complaint were one thing. This was another universe of trouble. He had not just poked a bear, he had walked into its cave and tried to steal its cubs. He looked around the diner, his eyes wild with panic. He saw the faces of the patrons, no longer scared but watching him with expressions of open contempt and disgust. He saw Hank, who was now standing with his arms crossed, his face grim. He saw Marcus, whose expression was one of sad, righteous anger. And he saw Williams, a man he had dismissed as just another suspect, now revealed to be the most dangerous man he had ever met in his life. The hunter had become the prey, and the trap he had so eagerly set for others had just snapped shut on him. The power shift in the diner was absolute and immediate. The invisible shield of authority that Officer Miller had worn so arrogantly had not just been pierced, it had been vaporized. He stood in the middle of the floor, stripped bare, his fear and incompetence on full display for everyone to see. The handcuffs still dangled from his right hand, a perfect, pathetic symbol of his utter failure. Special Agent Williams took control of the scene with the calm, methodical efficiency that defined his professional life. His first priority was to secure the situation and the evidence. Marcus, he said, his voice now calm but still carrying its newfound authority, please get the contact information of every patron who witnessed this, especially those who were recording. Inform them that they are witnesses in a federal investigation and that they may be contacted. Marcus, who had been waiting for a cue, nodded sharply and moved away, approaching the other tables with a quiet, reassuring presence. The patrons, who had been frozen in shock, now stirred into action, eager to help. The atmosphere of fear was replaced by one of righteous purpose. Williams then turned his attention to Hank. "Mr. Kowalski," he said, his tone softening with respect, "thank you for what you did. You are a brave man." He gestured toward the counter. "Your diner's security cameras, are they operational?" Hank, still looking slightly dazed, nodded. "Yeah, of course. 2 of them. One on the door, one covering the whole room. Records everything." "Excellent," Williams said. "We will need a copy of that footage. Do not let anyone, and I mean anyone, from the Oak Haven Police Department take possession of it or erase it. It is now evidence in a federal matter. Am I clear?" "Crystal," Hank said, his voice firming with resolve. He walked back behind his counter, no longer a victim, but a custodian of crucial evidence. Having secured the civilian witnesses and the physical evidence, Williams finally turned his full, undivided attention back to the catalyst of the chaos. Officer Miller hadn't moved. He was like a statue of a man watching his own world burn down. "Officer Miller," Williams said, his voice dropping the professional formality and taking on a sharper, more personal edge. "Give me your name and badge number." "Chad Miller, badge 714, the officer mumbled, his eyes fixed on the floor. He couldn't bring himself to look at Williams. "Officer Miller, badge 714, Williams repeated, committing the information to memory. "Your body camera has been active during this entire encounter, has it not?" Miller gave a weak, jerky nod. "You will not deactivate that camera," Williams ordered. "You will not mute its audio. That recording is now federal evidence. Is that understood?" Another pathetic nod. The dynamic was a stunning reversal. Just moments before, Miller had been the one barking orders, demanding compliance. Now he was the one being interrogated, his every action dictated by the man he had tried to arrest. He had been so focused on the superficial power of his uniform that he had never considered he might encounter a power far greater and more legitimate than his own. Marcus returned to Williams's side, a list of names and numbers jotted down on a napkin. "Got it," he said quietly. 7 witnesses. All of them are willing to give statements. 4 of them have video. "Good work," Williams murmured. He looked at Miller, who seemed to be shrinking in on himself. He saw a man utterly broken by the sudden, brutal collision with consequence. For a moment, a fleeting, fractional moment, he felt a sliver of something that might have been pity. Miller was a product of a broken system, a man whose worst impulses had been validated and enabled by his own department until they had finally, spectacularly, blown up in his face. But the feeling passed as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold reality of the damage Miller had done, and the damage he would have continued to do if he hadn't been stopped. He thought about the people in Miller's past complaints, the ones who didn't have a badge to save them, the ones whose days were ruined, whose rights were violated, who were humiliated and arrested, and had their lives turned upside down, all because they had the misfortune of crossing paths with this man. No, there was no room for pity. There was only room for justice. "Stay right here, Officer Miller," Williams commanded. "Do not move. Do not speak to anyone." Williams then pulled out his cell phone. He didn't dial 911. He didn't call the Oak Haven Police Department's main line. He scrolled through his contacts to a number he knew by heart. It was a direct line, one that bypassed local dispatchers and secretaries. He pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Civil Rights Division Assistant Director's Office." "This is Special Agent Williams," he said, turning his back on Miller to face the window. "I need to speak with Assistant Director Carlson. It's urgent. I'm reporting a Section 242 violation in progress, and the subject," he paused, glancing over his shoulder at the pathetic, trembling officer, "is a uniformed police officer." The call to Assistant Director Evelyn Carlson of the FBI's Civil Rights Division was a procedural move that carried the force of a tactical strike. It was a declaration that the incident at the Silver Spoon Diner was no longer a local police matter to be quietly handled and potentially buried by the Oak Haven PD. By invoking Section 242 of Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law, Williams had officially escalated the situation to a federal crime. He was reporting that a government official, Officer Miller, had willfully deprived individuals of their constitutional rights. It was one of the most serious accusations that could be leveled against a law enforcement officer. "Put him through," Williams heard the voice on the other end say, a note of urgency in her tone. There was a brief click, and then a new voice, sharp and focused, came on the line. "Williams, this is Carlson. Talk to me. What's your status? Are you safe?" "I'm secure, Director," Williams replied, his voice a calm, steady stream of information. "My associate and I are also secure. The subject officer is contained, though not in custody." In concise, clipped sentences, he laid out the entire event. He started with the baseless nature of the initial stop, Miller's immediate aggression, and the illegal demand for identification. He quoted Miller's racist, "your kind," and "you people" remarks verbatim. He detailed the fabricated justification of them casing the bank, Marcus's calm assertion of their rights, and Miller's response of placing his hand on his firearm. He described Hank Kowalski's brave intervention and Miller's subsequent threat to arrest the elderly man for obstruction. He concluded with the climax, the moment he was forced to reveal his credentials to prevent an unlawful arrest and a potential physical assault. "The entire incident," Williams finished, "has been recorded on the subject's own body camera, the diner's internal security system, and at least 4 civilian cell phones. I have multiple independent witnesses who are prepared to give statements." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Evelyn Carlson was a 25-year veteran of the Bureau. She had seen and heard everything, but the sheer blatant audacity of a uniformed officer attempting to arrest a federal agent, and a civil rights investigator at that, for the crime of eating breakfast while black was staggering, even to her. "Where are you now?" Carlson asked, her voice tight with controlled fury. "The Silver Spoon Diner, Main Street, Oak Haven," Williams replied. "The subject, Officer Chad Miller, badge 714 of the Oak Haven Police Department, is still on scene. I have instructed him not to leave." "Good," Carlson said. "Do not engage him further. Do not let the local PD take control of this scene. A federal team from the nearest field office is being dispatched to your location as we speak. They will handle evidence collection. I want that body cam footage, the diner security tapes, and the civilian videos secured under a federal chain of custody immediately." "Understood, Director." "And Williams," Carlson added, her voice dropping slightly, "I am personally making a call to the Oak Haven Chief of Police. His department has a serious problem, and he's about to find out just how serious it is. You did good work today, David. Stay safe until the team arrives." The line went dead. Williams lowered his phone, the weight of the federal government now squarely behind him. He looked over at Miller, who was watching him with wide, terrified eyes, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand that his fate was no longer in his own hands, or even in the hands of his department. His case was now the property of the FBI. Marcus walked back over, his face a mixture of grim resolve and sheer disbelief. "Federal team? They're really sending people out here?" "They are," Williams confirmed. "This isn't just about what he did to us, Marcus. This is about the integrity of the system. He used the color of law to violate people's rights. That's a federal crime. The Bureau takes that very, very seriously, especially when it's this blatant." The other patrons in the diner began to buzz with the new information. The words FBI and federal investigation were whispered from booth to booth. The significance of what they had witnessed was dawning on them. This wasn't just a local cop having a bad day. This was a major incident with national implications. Officer Miller seemed to finally grasp the enormity of his situation. He took a hesitant step toward Williams, his hands held up in a placating gesture. Look, agent, he said, the word agent tasting like ash in his mouth. This was all a misunderstanding. I was on edge. The call came in. I made a mistake. We can handle this here, right? A simple report. No need to get everyone else involved. It was a desperate, pathetic plea. He was asking the man whose rights he had just trampled to help him cover it up. Williams just looked at him, his expression cold and unyielding. A misunderstanding? He repeated, his voice dangerously soft. Officer, when you put your hand on your gun and stood over my friend, that wasn't a misunderstanding. When you threatened to arrest a 68-year-old man for standing up for what's right, that wasn't a misunderstanding. And when you told us that our kind is always causing trouble, you were crystal clear. He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only Miller could hear. You just committed a federal felony in a room full of witnesses and cameras. You don't get to talk your way out of this. You don't get to make it go away. All you get to do now is stand there and wait for the consequences of your actions to arrive. As if on cue, a police car, its lights flashing but siren silent, pulled up outside the diner. It wasn't a standard patrol car, it was a black and white supervisor's vehicle. A moment later, the door to the diner swung open, and a police captain, his face grim and pale, strode inside. He wasn't looking at Williams or Marcus. His eyes were locked on Officer Chad Miller with a look of pure, unadulterated fury. The reckoning had begun. Captain Frank Donovan of the Oak Haven Police Department was a man who had seen it all in his 30 years on the force. He was old school, a cop who believed in procedure, respect, and keeping his department out of the headlines. The call he had just received from an assistant director at the FBI had been the single worst phone call of his entire career. It was short, brutal, and left no room for negotiation. An FBI team was en route to his town to investigate one of his officers for criminal civil rights violations. The victim wasn't just any citizen, it was one of their own agents. It was a nightmare scenario. He strode into the Silver Spoon, his eyes immediately finding the source of this career-defining disaster. Officer Chad Miller, looking small, pathetic, and terrified. Donovan's gaze was like a physical blow. He didn't say a word to Miller yet. First, he walked directly to the corner booth where Williams and Marcus were standing. He was a professional. He knew who was in charge here, and it wasn't him. "Agent Williams?" he asked, his voice rough but respectful. "I am," Williams replied calmly. Captain Donovan nodded, his face a mask of grim professionalism. "I'm Captain Frank Donovan. I want to personally and professionally apologize for the conduct of my officer. What happened here today is unacceptable and will not be tolerated." "Your apology is noted, Captain," Williams said, his tone neutral. "But this situation is now under federal jurisdiction." "I'm aware," Donovan said, the words tasting bitter. "I was instructed by Assistant Director Carlson to come here and secure my officer until your team arrives. My only purpose here is to follow your instructions and not compromise your investigation." It was a total capitulation. The local police captain was formally acknowledging that he had no authority on this scene. He was there at the pleasure of the federal government. "In that case, Captain," Williams said, "your first action should be to ensure the integrity of the evidence. I want you to personally witness that Officer Miller's body camera is not tampered with. Then, you will relieve him of his duty weapon and his badge, here and now." The order was a calculated move. It wasn't just about safety, it was about public accountability. Miller wouldn't be quietly suspended back at the station. His humiliation would be as public as his offense. Donovan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Understood." He turned and walked toward Miller, his expression thunderous. Miller saw him coming and seemed to shrink even further. "Captain, I can explain—" "Shut your mouth, Miller," Donovan growled, his voice a low, furious command. "You have done enough talking for one day, for one career." In front of the entire diner, in front of the witnesses with their still-recording phones, Captain Donovan performed the most degrading ritual a police officer can endure. "Turn around. Place your hands on the wall." Miller, trembling, did as he was told. Donovan expertly unholstered Miller's Glock, engaged the safety, and removed the magazine. He then unclipped the radio from Miller's shoulder. And then came the final, most symbolic act. "Your badge, Miller. Give it to me." With shaking hands, Miller unpinned the silver shield, badge number 714, from his uniform shirt. The badge he had worn with such arrogant pride. He held it out to the captain without turning around. Donovan snatched it from his hand as if it were contaminated. "You are hereby suspended pending termination," Donovan said, his voice cold as a morgue slab. "You are relieved of all police duties. You will go directly to the station where you will wait in my office. You will not speak to anyone. You will not touch anything. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," Miller whispered, his voice choked with shame. "Go," Donovan commanded, pointing toward the door. Without making eye contact with anyone, the now former Officer Miller, a civilian in a police uniform, turned and shuffled out of the diner. He walked past the patrons who had once feared him, past the owner he had threatened, past the two men he had profiled and tried to arrest. He pushed the door open and walked out into the sunlight, a disgraced man whose life had been irrevocably shattered by his own hate. Captain Donovan stood for a moment, the gun and badge in his hands, the symbols of an authority Miller had so thoroughly abused. He walked back over to Williams. "The scene is secure, Agent," he said. "Thank you, Captain," Williams replied. "Now, about that body camera footage." Just as he spoke, two sleek black sedans pulled up outside. 4 men and 2 women in dark suits, their jackets cut to conceal the firearms on their hips, stepped out and walked purposefully toward the diner. They moved with an efficiency and confidence that made them stand out instantly from the local police. The FBI had arrived. The lead agent, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, entered the diner, and her eyes immediately found Williams. "Agent Williams, I'm Special Agent in Charge Reynolds. Director Carlson sent us. The scene is now under the control of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." She looked past him to Captain Donovan. "Captain, thank you for your cooperation. My team will take it from here. We'll need a formal statement from you down at the station." The handover of power was complete. The next few hours were a blur of professional, methodical investigation. The federal agents interviewed every witness, collecting their video files onto encrypted hard drives. They took a formal statement from Hank and made a forensic copy of his diner's security footage on site. They processed Miller's patrol car, and a federal technician took possession of the body camera, placing it in a sealed evidence bag. Throughout the process, Williams and Marcus stood by, observing. For Marcus, it was a surreal experience. He was seeing the system work in a way he had only ever dreamed of. It was swift, decisive, and overwhelmingly powerful. He was witnessing the inside of the house that David had talked about all those years ago, and he finally understood the kind of change his friend was trying to effect. When the federal agents were finished, Agent in Charge Reynolds approached Williams and Marcus. "We have everything we need for now," she said. "The U.S. Attorney's Office will be in touch. They're going to want to move on this fast." She looked at both men. "I'm sorry you had to go through this. No one should be treated that way." As the federal team packed up to leave, Marcus and Williams were left standing in the now quiet diner. Hank walked over, a fresh pot of coffee in his hand. "On the house," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Williams nodded. "Thank you, Hank, for everything." "You don't have to thank me," the old man said, shaking his head. "I just did what was right. You're the ones who are really going to make him pay for it." They sat back down in the booth, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving a profound sense of exhaustion in its wake. The morning that had started so peacefully had become a battlefield, but it was a battle they had won. Before the FBI agents had even finished logging the evidence, the battle for public opinion had already begun. The videos, captured from at least 4 different angles within the Silver Spoon, did not leak onto the internet. They erupted. The young woman who had filmed the most comprehensive and damning footage from Miller's initial approach to his final humiliating exit uploaded her video with a simple, devastating caption. "Oak Haven cop tries to arrest 2 men for being black. One of them turned out to be an FBI agent." The title was pure dynamite. Within the first hour, the video had 10,000 views. By lunchtime, it was over 1 million. It was shared, retweeted, and picked up by local news bloggers. By mid-afternoon, it was the lead story on national news websites. The headlines wrote themselves, each one more incendiary than the last. Racist cop's worst nightmare. Video shows officer trying to arrest on-duty FBI agent. It's always you people. Oak Haven officer's bigoted rant caught on camera before shocking reveal. Hero diner owner stands up to aggressive cop, defends customers in viral video. The story had everything. A clear villain, sympathetic heroes, a dramatic plot twist, and undeniable video evidence. Officer Chad Miller, a man no one outside of Oak Haven had ever heard of, was suddenly the most infamous police officer in America. His face was everywhere, frozen in a perpetual sneer of racist arrogance. His name became a hashtag, a meme, a symbol of everything wrong with modern policing. For the town of Oak Haven, the fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The police department's phone lines were flooded with furious calls from all over the country. The city's official social media pages were overrun with comments denouncing the department and demanding justice. Oak Haven, which had prided itself on being a quiet, safe, all-American town, was now the national epicenter of a conversation about racial profiling and police brutality. The Oak Haven Police Department and the City Council, caught completely flat-footed, went into crisis mode. Their initial instinct was to release a vague, boilerplate statement about being aware of the incident and launching a full investigation. But that kind of corporate doublespeak was no match for the raw, undeniable truth of the video. The public wasn't demanding an investigation, they were demanding a conviction. The pressure was immense. By the end of the day, the mayor of Oak Haven was forced to hold a press conference. He stood at a podium, looking pale and beleaguered, and read a prepared statement. He announced that Officer Miller had been suspended without pay and that the department would cooperate fully with the Department of Justice investigation. He condemned Miller's actions in the strongest possible terms, calling them an affront to the values of our community. But no one was buying it. Journalists immediately began digging into Miller's past. Within 24 hours, the stories of his previous complaints for excessive force and illegal searches were all over the news, painting a picture of a department that had ignored multiple warning signs and allowed a problem officer to remain on the streets. The narrative shifted from a single bad apple to a rotten orchard, a systemic failure of leadership and accountability. For Marcus and Williams, the sudden glare of the media spotlight was disorienting. Marcus's architecture firm was besieged by calls from reporters. Williams's name, though not his face, was mentioned in every news report, his status as an FBI agent making the story even more explosive. They both went dark, refusing all interview requests, letting the videos and the official investigation speak for them. They watched the story unfold from the quiet of Marcus's living room. It was strange to see their traumatic experience packaged for mass consumption, analyzed by pundits, and debated by strangers in comment sections. "It's out of our hands now," Marcus said, watching his own face on a national news broadcast. "It was always out of our hands," Williams corrected him gently. "It's in the hands of the public now, and the U.S. Attorney's Office. That's a powerful combination." The most profound impact of the viral verdict was on the people of Oak Haven themselves. The video forced a conversation that many in the predominantly white town had never wanted to have. For many, it was a shocking wake-up call, a realization that the ugliness of systemic racism wasn't just a problem for big cities, it was right there, in their own community, in their own charming downtown diner. Hank Kowalski became an unlikely local hero. People came to the Silver Spoon just to shake his hand, to thank him for his courage. The diner was busier than it had ever been, filled with patrons who wanted to show their support. They left huge tips and wrote messages of solidarity on napkins. The incident at the Silver Spoon had ripped the peaceful facade off of Oak Haven, and exposed the rot underneath. The cell phone footage had acted as a national jury, and their verdict was unanimous and swift. Chad Miller was guilty. The Oak Haven Police Department was complicit, and now the entire country was watching to see what would happen next. The wheels of justice, often so slow to turn, were now being propelled by the unstoppable force of viral outrage. While the court of public opinion delivered its swift and brutal verdict, the official wheels of justice began to turn with a deliberate, inexorable force. The evidence against Chad Miller was so overwhelming, so irrefutable, that his termination from the Oak Haven Police Department was a foregone conclusion. It wasn't a question of if, but of how quickly the bureaucracy could process it. The internal affairs investigation, which normally would have been a drawn-out process, was rendered a mere formality by the federal takeover. The FBI's evidence, the body cam footage, the diner's security tapes, the multiple cell phone videos, and the sworn statements from over half a dozen witnesses formed an airtight case. The video didn't lie. It showed Miller initiating a stop without reasonable suspicion. It recorded him fabricating a reason for the stop. It captured his racist language, his threats, and his illegal attempt to arrest a civilian who came to the aid of his customers. Captain Donovan, tasked with conducting the now redundant internal review, watched the body cam footage in his office. He watched it once, then a second time, a knot of professional shame and personal disgust tightening in his stomach. He had known Miller was a problem. He had seen the previous complaints and, to his everlasting regret, had signed off on the dismissals, choosing the path of least resistance. He had allowed the cancer of Miller's prejudice to fester within his department, and now it had metastasized into a national scandal. The most damning part of the review, however, came when investigators, under pressure from the DOJ, did a deep dive into Miller's personnel file. They didn't just look at the formal complaints, they looked at everything: his field reports, his traffic stop data, his arrest records. A data analysis team from the state police was brought in to help. The pattern they uncovered was horrifying. In his 5 years on the force, Officer Miller had initiated traffic stops on minority drivers at a rate nearly 400% higher than any other officer in the department, despite patrolling a predominantly white district. His consent searches of minority-owned vehicles almost never yielded contraband, yet he performed them at an astonishingly high rate. The data painted a clear, undeniable portrait of a police officer who used his badge not to enforce the law, but to wage a personal, racially motivated campaign of harassment. The previous complaints were re-examined, not as isolated incidents, but as part of this larger, damning pattern. The insufficient evidence that had cleared him before now looked like a deliberate failure of the system to see what was right in front of it. The Oak Haven PD hadn't just failed to discipline a bad cop, it had actively enabled him. 2 weeks after the incident at the Silver Spoon, the decision was made official. Chad Miller was terminated from the Oak Haven Police Department for gross misconduct, violations of departmental policy regarding biased policing, conduct unbecoming of an officer, and multiple violations of the civil rights of the citizens he was sworn to protect. The termination was noted as with prejudice, meaning a record of his firing and the reasons for it would be sent to a national database, effectively ensuring no other police department in the country would ever hire him. But his problems were just beginning. The day after his termination, the U.S. Attorney for the district held a press conference. Standing in front of the federal courthouse, with Special Agent in Charge Reynolds by her side, she announced that a federal grand jury had returned a 2-count indictment against former officer Chad Miller. Count 1. A criminal violation of Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, for his actions against Marcus Vance and David Williams. Count 2. A criminal violation of Section 242 for his actions against Hank Kowalski. The indictment of a police officer on federal civil rights charges was a rare and serious step. It signaled that the Department of Justice viewed Miller's actions not as a simple mistake or a policy violation, but as a willful and criminal abuse of power. The U.S. attorney made it clear that they would be seeking prison time. Miller, who had been hiding out in his small apartment, turned himself in that afternoon. The booking photo that flashed across news screens that evening was a pathetic sight. The smug, arrogant officer was gone, replaced by a man with haunted eyes, a disheveled appearance, and the terrified look of someone whose entire world had been justly and thoroughly destroyed. For Williams and Marcus, the news of the termination and indictment brought a sense of grim vindication. It wasn't a cause for celebration, but a solemn acknowledgement that the system, for once, was working as it should. "It's not enough that he lost his job," Marcus said, watching the news report. "People like him just move to the next town over and get a new badge. The indictment, that's different. That's real." "It's a start," Williams replied, his gaze distant. He knew better than anyone that one indictment couldn't fix a broken system, but it could send a message. It could create a precedent. It could, if handled correctly, become a catalyst for real, lasting change. The criminal case will deal with Miller, but the department, the city, they have a different price to pay. He was already thinking about the next step. The criminal case would punish the man, but the civil lawsuit he and Marcus were about to file would aim for something much bigger. It would force the entire Oak Haven Police Department to change its ways. The fight was far from over. With Chad Miller facing a federal indictment and his law enforcement career in ashes, the focus of the legal battle shifted from individual accountability to institutional responsibility. Williams and Marcus, represented by a high-profile civil rights law firm, filed a landmark federal lawsuit.
They didn't just sue Chad Miller.
They sued the Oak Haven Police Department, the city of Oak Haven, the police chief, and Captain Frank Donovan. The lawsuit was a masterfully crafted legal document. It didn't just detail the events at the Silver Spoon. It used the department's own data against it, laying out the undeniable statistical evidence of Miller's years-long pattern of racial profiling. The suit alleged that the department had demonstrated a deliberate indifference to Miller's misconduct, arguing that the leadership knew, or should have known, that he posed a threat to the civil rights of the community and did nothing to stop him. This, the lawyers argued, made the city itself liable for his actions. Simultaneously, Hank Kowalski filed his own lawsuit. His claim was just as powerful. He, a business owner, had been threatened, intimidated, and nearly arrested simply for lawfully defending his customers in his own establishment. His suit argued that Miller's actions had created a hostile environment and violated his rights, and that the city's failure to properly train and supervise its officers was the direct cause. Faced with two federal lawsuits, an active criminal investigation by the Department of Justice, and a national reputation that was now toxic, the city of Oak Haven's lawyers knew they were in an impossible position. The video evidence was indefensible. The data on Miller's policing history was damning. Going to trial would be a public relations bloodbath that they would almost certainly lose, potentially resulting in a jury award of catastrophic proportions. The city's insurance carriers and legal advisors came to a swift, unanimous conclusion: settle, and settle quickly. Negotiations began. Williams and Marcus made it clear from the outset that this was not about the money for them. They instructed their lawyers that any settlement had to include a consent decree, a legally binding agreement, overseen by a federal judge, that would force the Oak Haven Police Department to implement sweeping, non-negotiable reforms. The city, desperate to make the problem go away, agreed to almost all of their terms. 6 months after the incident, the settlement was announced. It was a historic victory for civil rights. The city of Oak Haven agreed to pay a combined settlement of $2.5 million. Hank Kowalski received $500,000 for the damages to his business and the emotional distress he had suffered. Williams and Marcus received a joint settlement of $2 million. True to their word, the day the settlement cleared, Williams and Marcus announced the formation of a charitable foundation. The entire $2 million was used as seed money to create a non-profit dedicated to providing free legal representation to victims of police misconduct and funding community-led police accountability initiatives. Their personal trauma was transformed into a powerful tool for public good. But the most significant part of the settlement was the consent decree. The Oak Haven PD was forced to 1. Implement a new state-of-the-art early warning system to automatically flag officers who showed statistical evidence of biased policing. 2. Completely overhaul its use of force policies and mandate de-escalation training for every single officer. 3. Establish a civilian oversight board with subpoena power to independently investigate all complaints of misconduct. 4. Require mandatory, ongoing implicit bias and constitutional rights training for all officers with yearly recertification. 5. Make all body camera footage from use of force incidents and citizen complaints publicly available within 72 hours. These were not suggestions. They were federal court orders. A federal monitor was appointed to oversee the department's compliance for the next 5 years. The Oak Haven Police Department was essentially placed under federal receivership, its autonomy stripped away until it could prove it had reformed itself. Captain Donovan was forced into early retirement, and the police chief resigned in disgrace. The settlement sent shockwaves through law enforcement circles across the country. It became a model for how to use civil litigation to force systemic change. It proved that departments could be held responsible not just for the actions of one bad apple, but for the systemic failures that allowed that apple to rot the whole barrel. A few months later, Chad Miller, facing the certainty of a long prison sentence, accepted a plea bargain. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of violating the civil rights of Marcus Vance and David Williams. He was sentenced to 36 months in a federal prison. The legal battles were over. The officer was punished, the city was held accountable, and meaningful change was enacted. But for Marcus and Williams, the scars of that quiet Tuesday morning would remain. Justice had been served, but the memory of the injustice they had faced would never fully fade. A year later, on a Tuesday morning that felt almost identical to that fateful day, Marcus Vance and David Williams sat in the same corner booth at the Silver Spoon Diner. The sunlight streamed in through the same windows, the air smelled of the same comforting blend of coffee and bacon, but something was different. The diner was quieter, more reflective. The people who came here now came with a shared memory, a piece of local history that had been forged in this very room. Hank, who had a few more gray hairs but stood a little taller, brought their coffee over himself. He didn't say much, just placed the mugs on the table and gave them a warm, knowing smile. A small, framed newspaper article about the settlement hung on the wall behind the counter, a quiet testament to the storm that had passed through. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the easy quiet of a friendship that didn't require constant conversation. The events of the past year had deepened their bond, transforming it into something more akin to brotherhood. "Have you heard from him?" Marcus asked finally, swirling the cream in his coffee. He didn't need to say the name. "I got a letter from his lawyer last month," Williams replied, his gaze fixed on the street outside. "Part of his plea deal involves a formal letter of apology. It was predictable, full of words like regret and misjudgment. Not a lot of ownership." "Does he get it?" Marcus wondered aloud. "Does a guy like that ever really understand what he did wrong?" "I don't know," Williams admitted. "I don't know if he regrets his racism or if he just regrets getting caught. Maybe there's no difference in the end. He's in a federal penitentiary, and the Oak Haven PD is under a federal microscope. The why almost doesn't matter as much as the result." They sat with that thought, the heavy, complex weight of it. They had won. By every conceivable metric, they had achieved a total victory. And yet, it didn't feel entirely triumphant. It felt necessary. It felt like a wound that had been cleaned and stitched, but would always leave a scar. The morning had been reclaimed, but it could never be erased. They had proven that the system could work, but they had also been brutally reminded of how easily and how often it failed. That Tuesday morning in the Silver Spoon serves as a powerful, chilling lesson. The chain of events was set in motion not by a crime, but by a perception, a prejudice that had been allowed to fester inside a man with a badge and a gun. Chad Miller's actions stemmed from a deep-seated insecurity, a need to exert dominance over those he had been conditioned to see as lesser. His arrogance was a shield for his own feelings of inadequacy, a man clinging to the power of his uniform because he had so little power in his own life. He saw two successful black men, and his worldview couldn't process it. His racism provided a simpler, more comfortable narrative. They had to be criminals. What if David Williams hadn't been an FBI agent? The question is a haunting one. If he had been just another man in a suit, he and Marcus would have almost certainly been arrested. They would have faced charges of resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, contempt of cop. They would have had to fight for their freedom and their reputations from behind bars, their word against a police officer's. The diner's security footage might have been lost. The witnesses might have been intimidated into silence. It's a story that plays out in obscurity every single day, ending not in justice, but in plea bargains, ruined lives, and a deepening distrust of the very system meant to protect. Their best protection, ironically, was a credential from that same system, a privilege most don't have. To better protect oneself, the only answer is to know your rights as Williams did, to remain as calm as Marcus was, and to hope there is a camera recording and a Hank Kowalski willing to stand up. The ultimate message here is not one of despair, but of accountability. It reminds us that prejudice is a poison, and when it infects those in power, it becomes a weapon. But it also shows us that accountability is the antidote. It's found in the steady lens of a cell phone camera, in the brave voice of a bystander who refuses to look away, and in the relentless pursuit of justice that holds not just an individual, but the entire system responsible for its failings. The fight for a just world is not won in a single dramatic confrontation. It is won in the small, daily choices we make, to speak up, to bear witness, to demand better. What happened at the Silver Spoon was a reminder that the price of silence is far too high. What do you think is the most powerful tool we have as citizens to ensure accountability? Have you ever witnessed a situation where you wished you had spoken up? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice and your story matter.